The important thing is this, that the biblical rayum does not refer to wild oxen, instead it refers to rhinos. And it is also clear from Psalm 92:10 that rayum were single-horned beasts, the unicornus rhinoceros. So to sum up, the Hebrew word is rayum, translated as monokeros in the Greek, showing that in the pre-Christian world, Greek-speaking Jews identified the Hebrew rayum with a single-horned beast. In the Latin Vulgate, St. Jerome, following the Greek, translates Psalm 22, 92, and Isaiah 34 as unicornus, and translates Numbers, Deuteronomy, Job, and Psalm 29 using the Latin rhinoceros, showing to us that St. Jerome not only considered unicorns and rhinos to be the same thing, but that he considered the Hebrew word rayum to be a rhinoceros. In 1545, Martin Luther translated the Hebrew rayum as einhorn in the German, and in 1611, the King James Version translated rayum as unicorn in English, which, according to the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, was not a mythical horse, but a rhinoceros, just as the Vulgate had said. Now some will ask, then what about the mythical horse with one horn? Where does that come from? The mythical unicorn is often depicted as either a horse or sometimes a goat with a large horn protruding from its forehead. The earliest report of such a creature appears in a Greek manuscript entitled Indica or India, written by the Greek historian and physician Ctesias. The manuscript was written in the 5th century BC, over 100 years after the Old Testament was complete. Ctesias writes of creatures that had been spotted in India. They were one-horned creatures, which he described as looking like wild asses or donkeys. Aristotle, in the 4th century, wrote of one-horned creatures, which he called the Indian ass. Strabo, in the 1st century AD, talked about one-horned horses living in the Caucasus area, and his contemporary, Pliny the Elder, also writes in the 1st century AD of one-horned creatures which he referred to as the Indian ox. Now, one question that needs to be asked is whether these one-horned creatures were horses, or is it possible that they were actually referring to one-horned Indian rhinos? Now, Ctesias, Aristotle, and Strabo all call these creatures horses or asses or donkeys, while Pliny refers to these creatures as oxen. But does that mean that these were horses? Not necessarily. Imagine this. You're a Greek. You're traveling through India. Now, you've never seen a rhino before, and then all of a sudden you spot this creature. How do you describe it to other people? One way is to compare it to another creature that people do know, like a horse or an ox. See, a perfect comparison is the hippopotamus. The name hippopotamus comes from the Greek river horse. But does a hippo look like a horse to you? I don't think so. But for some, that may be the closest creature that they can compare it to. A hippo looks like a horse that swims in the river, so it's a river horse. It is not that far-fetched to think that a rhino, which does have a similar body structure to a hippo, could be compared with a horse. In fact, if we look at Pliny's description of the Indian ox, it is described as followed. A very fierce animal called the unicorn, which has the head of the stag, the feet of the elephant, and the tail of the boar, while the rest of the body is like that of the horse. It makes a deep lowing noise and has a single black horn which projects from the middle of its forehead, 2 cubits in length. Horse-like body, feet like elephant, tail like boar, deep lowing noises, single black horn. That sounds like a rhino to me. In fact, in the Middle Ages, Marco Polo described a unicorn as follows: scarcely smaller than elephants. They have the hair of a buffalo and feet like an elephant. They have a single large black horn in the middle of their forehead. They have a head like a wild boar. They spend their time wallowing in mud and slime. They are very ugly brutes to look at. They are not as such as we describe them, when we relate that they themselves be captured by virgins, but clean contrary to our notions. Here, Marco Polo describes the unicorn, which sounds just like a rhino, and he also comments on how the real unicorns are nothing like how they are depicted in the medieval art. So then, it appears that the Indian ass described by the Greeks may have in fact just been an Indian rhino. But if the Indian ass was an Indian rhino, then how did we end up with medieval artwork depicting unicorns as one-horned horses? The answer to that one is quite simple. The Greeks compared the Indian unicorn to something that they knew, a horse-like creature. So imagine yourself as a medieval scholar. You read of a creature described as a horse with a single large horn protruding from its head. What's the first thing that's going to come to mind? A horse with a horn on its head. The same applies with a hippo. If I said to you to draw a river horse, you most likely wouldn't draw a hippo. Instead, you'd draw something like a horse with a mermaid tail, because that's the first thing that would pop into your head when I say the word river horse. It's like a game of Chinese whispers. One person describes the creature as best they can, and then another person tries to draw the creature as best they can based on that description. It's not a surprise if the picture ends up looking different to what the original creature looked like. I conclude this video with this. Are unicorns real? The answer? Yes. We call them rhinoceroses.